guys, thank you for having me. I debated long and hard about this GIF. We all talked about it for half a day, but we decided to do it anyways and try you out in the morning. But clearly, it's nowhere as advanced as the snow fight, so surely we can live with it. But I also wanted to kind of set the scene for you, because I haven't really done a lot of slides with GIFs before, and this is a departure from my normal style. So I wanted you to know that my references are from the vernacular of my 8-year-old. So most everything you're going to see is probably from one of those mandatory movie nights we're now doing on Saturday. So now I'm in love with the Lego movies, Tangled, a series of other things you'll see today. Right. So not all slides will be numbers and words, so I wanted you to know that. Nonetheless, this one is numbers and words, so that we get all the introduction in one. And what that says, and I don't want you to read through all of it, it's not just a bragging slide, believe it or not. It's there so we have some context towards kind of where I've been, which is back end, front end, banks, out of banks, and kind of everywhere in between when it comes to FinTech. So where it matters for us today, and what I'd like to talk about, is kind of my journey to having arrived at emotional banking. And that started with my first few days in Meniga, which was a tiny little Icelandic company that I was one of the first employees of. And by the time, can you guys hear me okay? Because when I move around, I'm not positively sure if the sound is perfectly the same everywhere. Excellent. So the story. And I'll try and keep it short because it's from ages ago and we'd like to finish sometime today. And I do know that we have a time constraint, which I'm not positively sure how well we're doing on it because I don't have a timer, but we'll try. So when I started with this particular company, they were having a product which was going straight to consumers, and it was also sold to a bank. An amazing place to be. And to my happiness, we stayed in that place and we kept having essentially a direct-to-consumer offering through Meniga.is, as well as we sold to banks. And by the time I left Meniga, we had sold to 20, 29 banks. So as you can imagine, I must have talked to a few 100,000 to do so. Not quite, but 200, I suppose. So one of the things we were doing that was key, I think, to how much we've learned about the consumer was the fact that we spent a lot of time thinking about, one, what can we do to wow the consumer when it comes to their finances, and two, what can we do to get these guys really engaged from a positive perspective. So very soon we arrived at the fact that we have to make it very emotionally engaging, right? So in some respect, you could even think of your finances as having an emotional value, and what you're looking at on the screen is an example of that. Some of your payments have been things that you've enjoyed, and some of them, or most of them, have been things you didn't. So we spent a lot of time figuring this out. Every year we'd go to Finovate, would make a new product out of scratch. What first principle designs, what would the consumer really love? What would they become connected to us? So that was awesome. Except at the same time we were selling this to the industry and trying to see if banks would like to do that in the same way, and they didn't. It wasn't quite as clear as we thought it would be. For one thing, we found ourselves having to explain continuously over and over again, no, it goes back to the feelings of the consumer. You want to make sure that not only have you done one survey and one piece of dry research, but that is how truly they feel about money. Because they actually do. I mean, money is one of the most important things to us, outside of family and friends. There's really no other bit of our life that's as important. And yet, if you look around, banks seem to be studying everything from how potatoes grow, and just last week they were studying the facial expression of bears. But nobody seems to sit down and think, how does my consumer feel about, when do they get anxious, how do they feel about the mortgage, none of that stuff. So in a way, it was because, of course, banks are banks, right? And we're not meant to be talking about this fluffy stuff. We're meant to be serious and talking about numbers and making sure the back end still works as tied with a string as it is. We want to make sure regulation is in place. So essentially, no one had time for that. I wish I used that GIF. Too late now. So essentially what we did was try and figure out, do they not sit around to study it because they just don't care? It's not something that actually irks them, and to a degree that's the case. I'll talk about it a bit later. But at the same time, we were meeting bankers every day who were smart people and engaged people, and they had their heart in the right place. Sure, and they knew, which was the most bizarre bit of the equation to me, they knew for a fact what it would take to make the most amazing bank in the world. It was just not translating into what the consumer was seeing. So my theory was, it's not their fault. I mean, these people are absolutely the right people. They're smart, they're amazing, we just need to get them engaged again. So after a while, I decided I'm going to go fix banking, as you do when you have a midlife crisis, and left my successful FinTech so that I do that. And essentially started a consultancy and a piece of research around how do we make a change in banks, and ended up with the concept of emotional banking, and the book as well come to the point as to how we ended up with the book. So what I was doing with this consultancy thing, I started from having conversations, starting to raise the topic with the boards of the banks. I thought, now I know all these CTOs, all these CEOs, I'm just going to sit down with them and like shake them into, don't be ridiculous, you got to think about people's feelings. At least that was the initial plan. So I would go in and talk about these amazing experiences, and they too could have all these things, and paint a picture of the wonderful stuff ahead. Also leave them with a very clear checklist on what they could be doing to start looking at their consumer from an emotional point of view. And one of the key things in that was that I was asking them to stay with their consumer self as much as humanly possible. And so checklists, painting a picture, eventually I ended up making these transformational workshops that were going to make everyone incredibly passionate again. And those were some of them, so we were doing those together. Except all of them just felt like I kept painting this picture so that we get a little bit more knowledge, we get a little bit more courage, and we certainly kind of spark the passion back into the hearts of the bankers. And it was working. People were sometimes excited. People were sometimes interested enough to kind of move the needle slightly. And to my surprise, there were some people who were able to transform themselves into the type of change agent inside, the type of banking superhero is what I call them, who could kind of change things and make that bank go in the right direction. But for the most part, I was over here talking about how awesome design was, how that's your actual strategy, how human-centered design is not just a thing you should put on a PowerPoint, how humans really do matter and we should stop giving the topic lip service but not doing anything. And it was working for the time that I was there. But it felt like every time afterwards, something like this was happening to bankers. They would get out of their consumer hat, go right back into the banker hat, if you wish.
Oh, sorry, boys. I have dreams like you know, just like such people. Warm and sunny, on an island that I own, and rested and alone. Surrounded by enormous piles of money.
And those piles of money were more their bonus than they were the money they could have made out of the consumer if they gave them the right experience. So very soon after, or not soon enough really, I became horribly frustrated, and I decided that going from making a product that you could see a consumer having a better life from to just telling people over and over the same thing was just not something I could do long term. I don't have the patience for that. So I went back to the drawing board and I thought, look, I need to find some form of a method that we can affect change faster, which is how I ended up doing what I'm doing today, which doesn't even apply just to banks, but to kind of any type of company. But to kind of wrap up everything that I was telling banks, I wrote a book and I did the research around it. So in the book, I don't know if anyone here read it, don't raise your hand, it's fine. So in the book, I tried to go through a number of concepts. I mean, one of the most edifying pieces in the book was talking to my editors, because they were just as virginal about FinTech as many other places, and they had no clue what I'm on about. So every time I would be going deeply into, but on the front end, it's a lot more important to, they would be like, I'm sorry, but could you like frame this? What is the front end? What is the back end? What are you talking about? So it is rather nebulous to the rest of the universe. So the book has a little bit of, this is what FinTech is, this is kind of what I understand the systems in FinTech are, and then I went into the research as to why is it that banks don't do better by their consumers. And if you see the title is horribly long, the point of that is if they read nothing else, bankers will read the title, will be good, because it still contains most of the things. And so some of the research that I was doing was towards, do they not do it because they're not a brand? That was the first place I arrived at. And today, later, you're going to hear about branding. And I think that's something we need to pay really careful attention to, because my research was suggesting that banks were so far from being a brand as compared to other industries, as compared to retail, luxury, automotive, you name it, people who care about making a product in a way that connects them to the consumer. So to me, branding is a lot more about what experience you give than it is about marketing. It's a combination of all, of course, but it's still where I arrived first. And then I realized eventually that it's all coming down to the organization and what the bank was like. But in the research, I came about all kinds of statistics that were absolutely shocking to me, because here we were saying that if you ask bankers, they would tell you resoundingly that they believe they have loyalty, they're good on that. But if you looked at some of the statistics, it made no sense. That didn't look like that's the case. Or if you ask bankers, they would tell you that the NPS score is through the roof and they have customer satisfaction and they're good, and that's not an issue whatsoever. But kind of, if you ask consumers, they would tell you the truth, which is, come on now, let's not, I mean, it's not as bad as the other bank that tried to make it worse for me, but over here, I'm not having like an Uber experience or anything of the sort. Right, so to me, this felt like banks were just sat there and ignoring what's happening around them. I mean, technology is enabling us to have all kinds of experiences, and it's not, just me or just you guys because you know about design. It's absolutely everyone is having the same level of digital experience, and yet when they go to work in a bank, they have to employ what I would call cognitive dissonance and forget about the real world and what technology is able to give them, and focus only on what they can do that day, which might be this piece. So from that perspective, if you take a step back, it's like business as usual is completely ignoring the fact that the world has passed us by. And even if you kind of ignore how fast technology is going in other areas, and if that's not your tornado, there are loads of other things that are coming to get banking. Doesn't seem to bother them. There's challengers, there's GAFA, there's open banking and experience layers, you name it. Everyone is coming for their lunch, and banks are still calm and feeling like they're scot-free and it's not an issue. And it just bedazzles me. Why do they think nothing's going to change? Because these statistics they did look at, and they're saying that customers never change banks, more or less, in the UK. A gross exaggeration, of course, in particular with our wonderful challengers. But if you look at initial stats when we started this entire journey, it's absolutely shocking. In America, for instance, 2 years ago, the financial brand was still reporting that as a number. I mean, that's not great intentionality. That's not something I would like to show my investor if I started a challenger bank tomorrow. So from a banker's perspective, from an incumbent's perspective, we're good, we're fine, we're home free. So what I couldn't understand was why all the other industries, if you looked at them, they were working incredibly hard to kind of make a brand and make their consumer happy. This guy scares me every time. But we weren't. And the reason they were working so hard is because their stats look like this. This is what keeps them up at night. Because one time, you have 5 seconds to kind of burn your bridges with that consumer, and you will do so on a bad digital experience. Not a problem we have in banking. So if you look, for instance, I'll give you a couple of examples that are very rudimentary and I collected myself. So don't shoot me. You guys know a lot more about design than I do, but from an empirical point of view, this is what I've seen in the hospitality industry in the last few years. So first off, they're amazing on convenience and kind of bringing you what you really need, right? If you look at this particular picture, which I wish I took a longer, wider shot, because the one right underneath would have been the room service one. So they did have a number for room service, but if you look at it, right in the middle, they have what really counts, what you're most likely to call for. You're going to call for pizza. You're not going to call for room service. You don't want to be told that entire long story of what they have made for your specials. You just want pizza. It's an emergency. we must have all been there. This one is amazing. I can't understand why this is not the standard everywhere. I mean, I'm going that direction. Why would I be standing in front waiting for it? I mean, it doesn't make any sense. Right, and then, you know, they work hard to entertain us when we're waiting in queues and so on and so forth. But more interestingly, they also apply, even in the real world where it's much, much harder, principles of design that are a lot more solid than that, which are essentially how to delight people and how to surprise them. And in the delight bit, I mean, I'm not delighted by the fact that they cover my thing, but I guarantee that the germophobes are. And in the surprise thing, I don't know if you guys can read it. I mean, that's sweet, right? That's endearing. You're sure to remember it. You're sure to maybe go back again, if you can. I mean, when is the last time you felt that way about a banking experience? That's right. I did, not long ago, and I'll tell you when. This one, to me, is the epitome of how some industries know their customers. That's KYC, not what we do on the regulation side. Because what happens, gentlemen, is we will be using one of those towels for makeup anyways. The only difference is we don't have to feel bad now. It is absolutely astounding from my point of view. I love those guys. I go back simply for their towel. One time they didn't have it, I completely had a mental breakdown. You can imagine. Right, so this, though, is the example I told you I'm going to give you today. For the record, I'm not affiliated with them. I don't even know them personally, really. No, none of that. I found them by absolute mistake, and I fell in love. And you guys, if you pull up a phone or a laptop and you go check it out, I am willing to bet money you're going to sign up even if you have other life insurance, because this is the first sign-up process I've seen in a very long while, where aside from emotional banking and just looking at the process in itself, it is so impeccably well done from the point of view of the actual journey that it draws you in. It makes it pleasant to sign up for something. It's absolutely mental. And you go through the steps and you can't believe that you've actually done it. I guarantee you'll get into it to kind of critique it and tell me wrong, because don't be ridiculous, how good can it be? And then you'll end up signing up. And if you do, you have to wonder if it isn't connected to the fact that I think they spent a lot of time figuring out what kind of emotions does it really bring when you're talking about life, right? So they boiled it down to, you know, fear of death, kind of bad, we probably shouldn't be talking about that. But the things that we can think of that would be positive in death, the things that would bring a smile on my loved ones' faces, those we can start showing. And this is an example. They have, I don't know, I didn't scroll down enough, probably hundreds of examples. And then they encourage you to come up with your own. So these are some of the only examples. This is where the sad news starts, right? Ready? These are some of these guys are actually the only example I can give you of hand-on-heart emotional experience in a financial service. So far. That is all I have. Before I found these guys, my slide used to be about a bank that made the password procedure slightly less unpleasant. It was a tiny iteration that meant it wasn't as painful as usual. So as compared to that, this is for real design from first principles. Which brings me to my last 2 points. I don't know how I'm doing on time. If I'm awfully fast, it's okay. We can drink more coffee. But it brings me to my last 2 points, as I said. So those are, we need to go back to figuring out exactly how people feel about their money. And that's for instance, this is some of the research we were doing at Meniga, and we found shockingly that you're not necessarily going up in happiness straight as your income is going up. It doesn't go quite, it's not that simple. There are many nuances in terms of what gives you anxiety, in terms of how that relates to your personality, how that works out in your particular social environment, you name it. And look, this is not academic research. We don't know if these are the absolute perfect numbers, but let's compare it with the other research out there. Yes, there isn't any. Now, even worse news, and you're not going to like this one. And I don't know how many people in the room from the respective bank, but this is part of a slide that a banker used to use. Amazing, right? A guy in a bank, very high up in a bank, talking about feelings. That's very cool, right? And even saying that people are more important than the technology. And the guy was a technologist himself, to a degree, kind of a technologist. I removed the logo and everything, but some of you would recognize it. Now, here's the sad news. The guy is not in that bank anymore, not really. And that bank doesn't have, that I know of, one experience or one feature where they can say, this particular thing, when you click it, I know you're going to laugh, or I know you're going to cry, or whatever it is. I know how you feel about it. Not one. Which brings me to my last point, and that is that if you do know of people that have done right by their consumers, that have designed with their heart in their minds, that have made money moments, that made you kind of, ooh, I like that, I should totally sign up, or I should totally continue with them, or something of any sort. So if you know of anyone, just send them over so they sign up for this thing. And in 6 months' time, we'll have a list of the absolute best experiences that are, I'm sure there are more out there than just Dead Happy. It's just the only one I found. So if you've worked with people that have done great from that perspective, if you know anyone, set their consumer down and ask them kind of, how do you feel about this? What's bad money for you? When do you get anxious? If they ask the right questions, they design from first principles, and they ended up with an experience that's now really connected and on brand, I'd love to hear from them. So please send them our direction. Because this is the way this is going to go, one of two ways. It either will show me that I was wrong, and there were like these amazing other experiences in the world I just don't know about because I've not paid attention, which I am dearly hoping is the case after all these years of work. Or it can go the other way, and we're not going to get much at all. And there's not going to be enough entries. And I think that says a lot about us as an industry, and it should at least light a fire, because if we don't end up there, if we don't start looking at emotions, what we're going to have is 20 years from now, not one of the incumbents around are still going to be offering an experience for the financial services. Thanks a lot, guys. That's it.